Good evening and welcome to the fifth of our webinar series, HERstory, History, Our Story, Learning About and Engaging with the Past. I'm Hasini Haputantri, the series moderator, and this webinar series is organized by the International Center for Ethnic Studies together with the support of Rosa Luxembourg Foundation, South Asia. So, just an update about what we've been doing so far with the webinar series. We've come a long way since we began. We first had 3 webinars which explored our different approaches to past with a historian, an archaeologist, and a sociologist. We also started addressing some of the more practical issues with our last presentation from Natasha. And today we want to really go beyond the Sri Lankan boundaries and explore another context in search of lessons learned and synergies and reflections that we can learn from. So let me introduce you to Nayla Hamadeh. She is the president of the Lebanese Association for History, which she co-founded in 2013 together with a group of teachers, academics, and historians. She has been an activist seeking to mobilize and empower history teachers, not just in Lebanon, but across many other countries that are striving towards building more inclusive and critical educational experiences. And it was my privilege to be known to Nayla and to have actually studied with her together some time back. And she has been an immense experience to me in the work that I have been doing. So welcome, Nayla. It's lovely to have you here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Hasini. I look forward for an interesting and reflective session with all of you. I would like to start by sharing my screen. I hope it works. It takes a moment to show, I think. I would like also to thank ICES for this invitation, and I hope that through this series of webinars, we can establish connections among history educators despite the social distancing and the confinements imposed on us everywhere in the world by the pandemic. In fact, in the last webinar, Dr. Pereira reminded us that the present is not an unconnected time zone. The present has references to the past, he said, as much as it has anticipations to the future. By better understanding the past, we may better understand the present and maybe deal with its complexity. We might even improve our anticipation of the future. Coming from a country torn by all sorts of conflicts, most of them kept unresolved for years, it is hard to dissociate the present from the past. We live the past in our everyday life, so studying the past becomes crucial. And history education becomes the most, I would say, the most critical vehicle to bring society into cohesion and peace. Let me start by introducing you to the case of Lebanon. As you may know, Lebanon has suffered a 15 years war between 1975 and 1990. It is one of the longest and most violent civil wars of the 20th century. Of course, wars do not happen overnight. The seeds of the conflict go back to decades prior to 1975. The conflict has ideological, political, economic, social roots, as well as regional dimensions, and I would say religious dimensions. Wars also do not end when their ending is declared. Today, 3 decades later, we realize that the protractions of the war continue until our day. What is sure, however, is that after the war, the Lebanese found themselves in a deeply divided society. The country tried to move on. It tried to move on with an amnesty law, and without any transitional justice mechanisms, without accountability, without any serious reconciliation process. And the last 15 years have been marked by political instability, polarization, frequent deadlocks, and I would say more divide. Maybe there are new lines of divides, but we have more social cleavages appearing. This period is also characterized by an increase in corruption and dysfunctional governance, and by the huge influx of Syrian refugees whose presence in Lebanon complicated matters even more as they unveiled the fragility of the Lebanese state. Last year, on October 17, 2019, the Lebanese went to the streets in big numbers. They went to the streets refusing corruption, austerity measures, increased taxation, and the uprising brought together people from different backgrounds and ideas. They were all refusing the autocracy imposed on them by the political elite that has abused the country's resources. The fiscal downfall unleashed in September 2019 continued. All the Lebanese witnessed and still are their country's bankruptcy. Yet, the uprising revealed deep societal divides. The revolutionary, as they became to be called, were faced not only by the power-hungry political elite, but also by their followers. Things were getting very complicated when the global pandemic hit Lebanon. The uprising cooled down, but the country continued its political stalemate. And economic downfall. And conversations reveal more and more divides despite all the awareness really that was raised as part of the revolution. And to top up the existing crisis, I would say, to top up the existing crisis, the Beirut port exploded on August 4 in one of the biggest blasts that the world has known. With the blast came death, destruction, and I would say a feeling of loss and trauma that will last for long. The blast and its aftermath exposed the total failure of the state. While citizens went on the streets to support victims, the government's paralysis was stunning. While citizens organized commemorative events, officials remained unconcerned. And more importantly, while citizens demanded accountability, the political elite, still standing despite everything, and despite the intervention of many world powers, this political elite is finding ways to undermine the investigative process, and there is fear today that no one will be held accountable for the blast. The blast itself revealed again and again how divided society is and how complicated the cleavages are. I am sorry if this contextualization took a long time. We are gathered today to talk about history education. But I had to do it. The conflict and its aftermath in Lebanon, they're not particular to Lebanon itself. Countries like Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, ex-Yugoslavian countries are still trying to deal with their violent past. What have we tried to do in Lebanon? In Lebanon, the peace agreement has stipulated the unification of history textbooks. The government, having failed to issue a post-war history curriculum, refrained from introducing any pedagogical changes in history classrooms. This, of course, led to the marginalization of history education. So, How does a society deal with its own history under such circumstances? That was the big question. The curricular deadlock meant that generations of students are not given the chance to study the history of Lebanon post-independence. They studied that Lebanon took its independence in 1943, and after that there is a void, a hollow void, as if this particular past is a period hanging somewhere in a different world, waiting for us to bring it back. In 2013, we decided, a group of us educationalists, to address the curricular deadlock. We were all eager to make a change in how history is taught. We had waited for a new curriculum for 23 years after the war. It didn't come. So we moved. We established what has become to be known as the Lebanese Association for History. And we went together on a learning journey. The premise that leads our work is that a better understanding of the past contributes to a better understanding of the present, better understanding of each other, and thus to a more coherent society. Our questions were: how do we ensure that students are engaged with the past actively and reflectively? How can we bring the silent stories to become topics of discussions in the classroom? How do we prepare students to accept that many interpretations of the same event exist and there are reasons for that? How do we convince everyone, students, teachers, school administrations, parents, and society in general, that history is not a story that we tell to our children for them to retain? How can we convince that many stories exist side by side and that they are told and they all hold parts of the truth? We are trying to spread awareness about it. We are also building learning communities among history and civics teachers. In many cases, they told us that they have never ever had the opportunity to think about it. They have never had the opportunity to work with each other. The other, that person that they thought is very different from them, became their colleague, became their friend. This is where it started. But how do we convince everyone that history is not static, that it changes, and that our understanding of the past also changes? The questions that we ask lead us to build different understandings of the past. Let us take the August 4 blast as an example. Historians may ask, why did the port of Beirut explode on August 4, 2020? How did the August 4 explosion affect the lives of people in Beirut? How did Lebanon deal with the August 4 explosion? How is the August 4 explosion remembered? Why do interpretations of this event differ? This is a sample of inquiry questions about it. A different learning path opens with each of these inquiry questions. They involve different histories. We can discern the official layers, the ordinary people's layers. We can also see women and men and children involved, economic sectors, social life, recreation, education, health being scrutinized to answer these questions. We will also find previous traumas and fears surfacing, social divides rising. So students, like historians, learn to choose the question that they will focus on and develop their own understanding and historical claims. And when they go on a journey to answer this question, what do they need from us? Exactly like historians, they will need to read thoroughly whatever is available to them. They also need to examine a variety of resources, question these resources, or build on them as evidences to develop their own accounts of the past. They also need to engage in critical discussions about the topic under study. This is where the biggest challenge lies, because the teachers need to learn to dissociate themselves from the sensitive histories that they are teaching. It is not easy. Teachers are part of the social fabric. They belong somewhere on this or that side of the event. Thus, working with teachers came first for us. It is important that teachers help children to learn to discuss the past critically, base their claims on multiple evidences, understand and present multi-perspectives, look for the untold stories, whether they are hidden stories or forgotten stories, and link the past to the present. This might seem kind of a de facto for us educationalists, but if we look more thoroughly at our educational systems, I would say everywhere in the world, how does history education look like? Isn't the grand narrative mostly adopted? Especially in countries that have emerged from violent conflicts, where bringing to the classroom complexities of the past might be considered as being too sensitive. How will our children deal with the present if they cannot deal with the past? What are we expecting? Aren't teachers still the main source of information for their students? How will students learn to find and deal with different sources if we do not prepare them for that? Aren't curricula and practices avoiding the more sensitive past or being more subtle when it comes to our past, quote unquote, and bringing in some multi-perspectives, but mostly when it is about, quote unquote, their past? Think about it. What can we do to help? We have two competing understandings of shared education. Building unity through a consensual narrative, or building a better understanding of the past and the present through historical inquiry and critical reflection of the past. In fact, we need to be working on different matters. If it doesn't come through the door, bring it through the window. This is a saying here in Lebanon. We use it every day. So now I'm using it with regard to curricula and with regard to inclusion. So if something is not in the curriculum, let us find a way to bring it in. For us, we were told that teaching the Civil War is difficult and too sensitive. We brought it in through an oral history path. Students learned how to conduct oral history research. They interviewed people around them who had lived the war. They asked them, how did the war affect the lives of women? How did it affect school life? How did it affect the lives of people in small villages? How did it affect transportation? How did it change how people marry, love, make friends? And believe me, they learned a lot about the war by asking such questions. It wasn't there, we brought it by the window, through the window. Second, we need to address inclusivity. So far, history education was mostly about men. Where are the women? Why is it always about leaders and heroes? Where are the ordinary people? Why is it about political and military events? Where are the other realms of life? I really admire Euroclio for bringing in football as part of teaching history. I wonder how much we can learn from the history of the Olympics or of local championships, as a matter of fact. Where is music, art, science, technology in history education? Particularly in societies affected by violent conflicts, we dig into the past to uncover stories that are told, that are untold, unheard. As a child, I used to wonder, where were the women? I used to imagine that they were sitting in their homes all the time without any role outside of their own house. From all my school years, I remember a few women mentioned in our history. Where are the others? Inclusivity is not a challenge. Inclusivity is a must. Oral history is a good vehicle to address untold stories. Multiplying resources is another. Teachers should not be bound with the textbook. Today, especially with the challenges imposed on all of us by the pandemic, the world is our limit. Yeah, those challenges open doors because they made the world our limit. Can you imagine what is there on the internet? Let us bring everyone to the history classroom. Everyone. Invite them to the history classroom. I will go back here to women. Think how can art help us understand the role of women in different periods of time? How do crafts help? And if they were not in politics and the military at the time, they were somewhere else. Let us bring other stories to the conversation. Let us dig for them. Thirdly, teaching history involves teaching communication. How to communicate ideas. When teaching sensitive histories, it becomes more crucial to build students' communication skills, bring in non-violent communication, dialogue skills, listening skills into the learning process. A lot of goodwill is being lost between words. History teachers in general rely on language teachers to teach communication. We realized at some point that we have a big role in that. History is a discipline. It has its own concepts, skills, and also its own forms of communication. Whether through written or oral language, through art, technology, or any means of communication, children need to learn to convey their historical claims and interpretations critically, reflectively, and based on evidence. How are we preparing them, we, the history teachers, for that in the classrooms? I'm leaving you with a lot of questions. Consider them as food for thought, and let us listen to you now. Let us talk, waiting for your questions.
So thank you very much, Nayla, for that very, very reflective sharing of experiences, and also taking us in very different directions, and to making us realize the kind of parallels that we have, although we think that Lebanon is not even a South Asian society to which we may immediately feel a connection to. I mean, it's a Middle Eastern country, and we would expect less cultural affinity to Lebanon, but to see what you are going through right now resonates so much with some of the issues that we are also facing here today is really eye-opening. So I'm going to open the Q&A. I'm inviting all our attendees and participants to please post your questions in the Q&A box. You can access it down there on the Zoom column. So please type it in and we can start. We can also have the option of voting some of those questions up or down in case we have quite a few. You can also express your willingness to take certain questions more than others. So I'm inviting you for that. And you can also post questions in Sinhala and Tamil if you wish. So I'm inviting you to do that as well. We will have translators ready to sort of have them translated back to us. While Nayla would be answering them in English, you will still be able to follow them in Sinhala and Tamil in the interpretation channels. So while we wait for the questions to roll in, Nayla, I want to pick on something that you mentioned, which I thought we haven't discussed so far in our webinar series. You mentioned about oral history and the importance of oral history. So for the benefit of some people who may not be as familiar with the oral history approach, could you share us a few examples on how you use oral history in your context in Beirut?
Thank you for the question. As a matter of fact, when we started our efforts, we didn't think about oral history. It was not something that is on the desk, I would say, on our desks. But eventually we realized that if we are to bring new topics that are not included in the curricula, we need to find ways for them in. And we thought of skills and competencies that we want our students to acquire through their education. And we realized that oral history empowers them and makes them capable of doing interviews, of asking the right questions, of listening to the narrators, of comparing different narrators' stories. And so there is a lot involved in the process of oral history. And this is where we thought that, for example, when teaching about conflict like the civil war in Lebanon, it's good to use oral history to bring in voices that will eventually also maybe not be included in the curriculum. Because usually, as you may know, when we study conflicts, we're always faced with the political dimensions, economic dimensions, and then at the state level, and we hardly see what happened to women during the war, or how did they contribute to resilience during the war, or to the war itself sometimes, and what happened to children, what happened to some marginalized groups, what happened to some areas that no one will talk about. They will bring in the big ideas, advance the classic approach to studying a war. So we will be missing on a lot of understanding needed for us to build connections among different groups in Lebanon. So we thought that, working with the public schools students and helping them to conduct their research and to go and ask around them, because for a long time, even talking about the war was kind of a taboo in Lebanon. If you are talking about the war as if you are bringing back the war, this is what they used to tell us. But the students discovered a period of time that affects their lives today tremendously. They discovered it through their own research, their own oral history research. And they were able to share their findings with a general public through an exhibition that we have organized. And it was there when they realized the impact of their work, because as part of that public, you had people coming in, listening to the audios of the interviews, older people, those who have lived the war, and they were listening and crying. You know, they were bringing out their trauma that was repressed for 15 or 20 years and brought back. Now, the students were able to conduct conversations with those adults and learn even more. That is one example for our use of oral history. I think your micro is off, Hasini.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding Nayla. So the questions are rolling in, and I'm going to start with this one from Fida Malak. So she is asking, what can be done when students go home and parents try to undo what has been done? What can teachers do in this case? So she's talking about the challenges that lie not just within the classroom, but also beyond, which is a very, very realistic situation in all countries, I think.
It's a very interesting question, in fact. And that's why I pointed out when I was presenting that it is so hard to convince not only students, not only teachers, not only administrations, but parents and society in general, that history is not about one static story. It's so hard. After all, parents, like all of us, have studied at school one story, a grand narrative. And they believe that this is how it is. We cannot think differently. There are no other perspectives. There are no other interpretations. This is how the past happened. We learned to believe this. And the parents are part of this generation that learned history that way. It's so hard. And now we are in kind of a moving from one stage to another. We are presenting history as a discipline, and we are inviting students to think differently. And this is where we will face parents. What we can do is to keep on convincing the kids themselves, the children themselves, that thinking comes first in history. Okay, thinking and using evidences comes first in history. They have to convince their parents, and we might think that we might decide that it's important for us history educators to address parents. And in fact, for us at the Lebanese Association for History, we're trying as much as possible to come out publicly on television, when television channels receive us, on radio, everywhere where the general public, to which the parents belong, can start hearing a different discourse about how we teach history.
So we have a question from Harshana Tushara Silva. Both Lebanon and Sri Lanka are countries which went through civil war. How do you see the challenges of teaching contemporary history? I asked this question earlier as well, and how we overcome the bias of interpretations of contemporary history and politics from different parties. So I think that's a really interesting question to tackle, a challenging one as well. So your thoughts on it, Nayla?
It's true. In fact, when I visited Sri Lanka, several times I visited Sri Lanka, I felt like so much in common with Lebanon in terms of its beauty and in terms of its challenges. I have to admit that. We are facing a lot of challenge in teaching the contemporary history. But the challenges do not come from the students themselves. They come from the politicians who do not want us to teach that particular difficult history because it will show what they have done. It also comes from society in general, fearing creation of more tension, and they are fed up. They don't want to go to that violent past. They don't want to talk about it even. They just want to forget it. And I am sure in Sri Lanka too, we have people who think that way. What surprised us a lot is that when we started teaching about the violent past, which is a contemporary period of our history, we realized that students were eager to learn and they were much more open-minded than their parents or other adults in society. But we also discovered, surprisingly, that parents who in the beginning hesitated and at some time they complained at the school administration. They say, why are you teaching our children about the war? It's not even in the curriculum. Don't teach them. This is not good for them. With time, they came back, those same parents, and I have evidence for this from more than one teacher. They came back to say, well, that's an interesting approach of teaching the war, because we didn't impose a narrative. We didn't bring in one narrative. We brought in more than one perspective. We studied the war at many layers. We led the students through several sources so that they come up with their own conclusions without imposing on them one grand narrative. And I think in Sri Lanka, if you adopt such an approach, you can live through a similar experience to ours.
Thank you for that really enlightening answer, Nayla. There is a follow-up question which I would like to bring up now from Prabho Mihindukula Surya. He is asking, have you experienced any pushback and opposition from more traditional guardians or sectarian histories, accusing you of trying to bring in secular and Western ideology through the window, this example of the window that you do, because this is something very, very present and real for Sri Lankan context. So we are curious to learn how you are facing it over there.
In fact, yes, I often describe our journey as a journey of walking on eggshells. You're walking slowly, afraid of intervention or opposition coming from here and there. So far, I would say, as long as you are working with educators and in school settings and with educational centers, I would say, we haven't had such a strong reaction from the others. We are very keen on walking on eggshells. We are keen not to push it too far. So yes, we thought about it. And what we've done is that we decided that the methodology comes first. So if we are able to choose topics that are sensitive enough to start training teachers to apply such methodology with students, but not too sensitive. Too sensitive might bring a backlash. So we took the strategic decision to work slowly, gradually, step by step. And so now we work on what we call sensitive, but not what we call extremely sensitive. And what is extremely sensitive are things, for example, that have to do with religious identities, sectarian identities. These are too sensitive. Do we need them right now? Let's build the thinking. Let's build the competencies. Let's build the dialogue. Let's start it. And then with time, slowly, we will have generations of youth who are more ready to tackle the more sensitive histories. Don't dig into the most sensitive part of your history.
Yes, so we have two questions going in the direction of inclusion of women. I told you this will be a very, very often raised issue even in our previous webinars. So Nimanta Narampanawa or Nimanta Narampanawa is asking, why is it that women's voices are not included in history? How important is it to include women?
Nimanta Narampanawa has raised the question, why is it that women's voices are not included in history? how important is it to include women's histories? And was there another question that you were going to answer alongside it, or was that all, Hasini?
Yes, there was a question about how to do it. There was an anonymous question on how to include women's narratives to mainstream history curricula. That was the two questions.
Okay, so I found that question, so let me read it out to you. What are the ways in which narratives of women can be integrated into mainstream history education at schools and outside classrooms?
That's a very good decision. I would like to start by the first one, which is the why they're not there. In fact, you are all aware why they were not there. For decades, curricula were conceived by men. History was written by men most of the time. And it was not until the 20th century and I would say the mid 20th century when women's voices came up. And this is our role as educators to bring in inclusiveness to the history curricula. And when it's not possible, to bring it to the classroom. And this is where, going back to the previous question regarding oral history is an excellent vehicle for bringing in women's voices and histories to the classrooms. Let's not wait for the curricula to be fixed. Let's push for that, work for that, but at the same time, let's not wait for that. Anytime we can invite women to our classrooms, whether through internet or physically, anytime we can do research that that focuses on different aspects of a historical event and so regarding women. So we have the responsibility to do that in our classrooms. Let's not wait for the curricula, but at the same time, let us push for the curricula to include more exposure of the role of women in societies throughout their past. There is a lot. If we keep focusing on politics and military history, political and military history, we might not find enough women involved. But what if we include social history? What if we include the history of thoughts and beliefs? What if we include the history of crafts and industry, agriculture, etc., where women had also bigger roles? Let's bring them in, let's find those stories. And we have a very nice incident that happened, and one of our programs with teachers, we chose an event that happened in the 20th century in Lebanon, and we call it the Tobacco Worker Uprising. Okay, we digged, and we found out that the first ever martyr among workers in Lebanon was a woman who contributed to this tobacco workers uprising that happened in some parts of Lebanon, particularly in the southern part of Lebanon. We brought up her story, and we designed learning engagements around it. And even the teachers were like surprised. How did you find out? How did you bring the story of what they hear? How did you discover her? And we said, if you ask, if you look around you, you will find that women played very important roles in their society. And even if they didn't play the role and they were the victims, even that side of it, we can bring it to the classroom. We should make an effort, all of us, to try to find significant stories where women where women played a role, and we can set up the stories around them and bring them to the classrooms.
Exactly. And also, when you were discussing about art, Nayla, I was thinking, if you look at the textbooks of history, there are no women, hardly any to be found. But if you look at art history is all about women. some reason, right? So that's, I mean, and it's interesting to note the overrepresentation of focus on women and the way it is being done, what kind of representation that you find throughout, even throughout ancient history, which you don't find if you come to mainstream history. So I think I was thinking when you were talking about art and thinking of ancient history and ancient art history and the representation of women in both areas, which is completely disproportionate, I think. So it was just an interesting observation that crossed my mind. But let me move on to the next question raised by Mario Gomez. This question rose from all previous webinars, which discussed the challenges of teaching multiple and often conflicting histories. Does the teaching of more global history help in reconciling conflicting narratives? Does it help to know that other societies also witnessed such raw experiences, even if we as a society are reluctant to talk about it? Did you get the question? May I repeat it?
No, of course I got the question, because this is part of our life, in fact, and exactly this is the type of question that we asked ourselves. I have to confess, I have a confession to make. I was a history teacher for a very long time, and I never thought about all of this. And then when in 2008, I would say, conflict came back, you know, in Lebanon very strongly, and the country became very polarized, and my students started getting involved in politics, while before that they never even knew anything about it. I started reading a little bit more, and then I got trained a little bit more. I joined some workshops here, programs there, and I was personally surprised that our case is not the worst case in the world. You know, we always feel that it's only us, it's only our society that is divided and that has so much conflict. And then I realized that no, others have lived the same, and even worse, I would say. In many ways, I saw conflicts in other countries. They were worse than ours now. And then it made me feel better about myself, about my country. And this is what I always try to convey to teachers and to students and to everyone, that it is not about us, that conflict is part of society, and violent conflict happens everywhere in the world, even in the countries don't want to name right now, but in countries that we think are in the developed world or in the most advanced countries in the world. Even there, we have violence, we have violent conflicts that are either brought up to the scene clearly, or that are still latent, I would say, and will show eventually. So it's not about us, and we will learn a lot from others. We should learn from others. And at the level of teachers and curriculum makers, I would say it is crucial to learn from experiences in other countries, because you have different models in other countries in how they dealt with their past in education. And it's very important to decide which model suits us best. We don't have to take that model, but we can elaborate our own model, come up with it based on experiences of others. We don't have to try from scratch.
Thank you. There's a very beautiful question raised here. Unfortunately, we don't know, it's an anonymous attendee that's raising the question. As you mentioned, collecting oral histories also involves intergenerational dialogue and transfer of memory. What is your experience of memories of trauma being transferred from one generation to the next, and the negative impacts it can have? Can you share some insights on how this can be effectively addressed or approached by educators?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I have tried to give some context about Lebanon. And unfortunately, as you have heard me speaking, the conflict and the war in Lebanon ended in the 1990. but we kept living phases of new conflicts and violence till today. And it is very interesting to look around us and see how much intergenerational trauma is passed from one generation to the other. We see how we deal with new conflict with a lot of tension and fear, and parents are like they go mad, and some our kids don't understand why we go mad. And then with time, you notice that many of them carry the same fears, the same trauma that we have hidden for a very long time. For us at the Lebanese Association for History, we realize this a lot. And that is why we're saying it is important to address that past. It's important to talk about it. Talking about what happened brings those memories that are buried inside us, they bring them to the surface. On the surface, it's easier to deal with them. And that's why we, as mentioned in the question, we used oral history. That is one vehicle that we used. But we used also analysis of documentaries or films, art films or artworks, etc., so that we bring in conversations about the past. It is important to find ways to create the intergenerational conversation. Not only wait for the trauma to be passed from one generation to the other, but also to open that conversation. The students who did the oral history project about the war, they asked the adults about the war, and then the adults were saying, why do you want to ask me about it? I don't like to talk about it. Some of them refrained and they said, we will not talk about it. Others were more generous. And when they were generous, the children felt that for the first time, because some of them interviewed grandparents even. So for the first time, they had the chance to really talk and ask about what happened. And then they started understanding the elderly more. They started to feel for them, to understand where do their tension and anxiety come from. It is a vehicle, definitely. Using art is another vehicle, but creating any kind of space for intergenerational dialogue is crucial for this, to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. We have another question going in the same direction, but approaching it from a very sensitive angle. And this is raised by Shantini in Tamil. How can one record oral histories in a context where the experiences of war are approached from a political angle? I hope you understand the question. So this is about the politicized context within which we all work, and asking how can you use a methodology like oral history in such a politicized context?
I would say that's a big challenge. And that is why you might want to focus on a topic related to the conflict, but that is not highly politicized. Make the conflict human. I mean, the human dimension helps a lot, because we will realize that eventually all parties went through the same human experience. So depoliticize it, bring it to the level of the individual, bring it to the level of the personal story. This is my story. It might not be everybody's story, but it's my story. You cannot deny it. So, but my story tells a lot about that period.
Nayla, what a beautiful answer. Thank you so much for that. So let's move on to our next question, raised by Danushka Marasinghe. Social violence and identity are created by education. And as a performing artist, how we recreate the people mind for change and body politics, change their mind and body politics. Sorry, did I read that question correctly? Yes. Should I read it? I think It's about social violence and changing the body politics of it.
Changing the politics of social violence.
Yes. Great. Let us go to another question, and let me get back with a more clear. Maybe it was a wrong interpretation from my side because I lost most of the questions. So bear with me till we get there. There is a question raised on Facebook. Do you have any examples from the classroom where inclusive histories are taught, discussed, especially with young students? So this is really focusing on the young students.
I'm always impressed by young students. The younger the students are, the better to work with them, the easier to work with them. Students, the kids, the small children, they are much more open and much more inclusive than the older ones and than their parents. So at the youngsters level, I would say the small children, it's easy to introduce inclusivity. It's not difficult at all. For us, we have been working mostly by middle school, with teachers of middle schools and high schools. I cannot claim that we have been working with teachers of the primary school. But I have personally had some encounters with primary school kids, and I know that they are much more open to inclusiveness. And this is what I can say right now.
Yes. We have another question from Facebook. Hold on 1 minute. Thank you, Nayla, for your input. Your point about history teachers teaching communication skills is so important. Are history teachers in schools convinced about this? And what are your challenges working with the history teachers themselves?
Well, we can convince them. This is what we do exactly. As part of our work, we work with teachers on many aspects of the teaching learning cycle, and we bring communication to the front. With them, we do exercises, we do activities to show how we can improve verbal communication, written or oral, or communication through art, or communication through production, or through technology or industrial productions, or any other means of communication. So, and we show why it's important and how we can improve a sentence, for example. We take sometimes just a sentence and we work around how can we improve the statement, how we can make it more focused, more credible, historical explanation. We also work with them on improving or enriching vocab. We assume that children know how to use verbs to express change, or how to use words to express diversity, etc. So they don't. We need to bring into them a wealth of maybe a pocket of terms every time to we present it with them. We use the terms, we explain the nuances between them. So we work with teachers on this, and I haven't seen teachers except embracing this. You know, I haven't seen them refusing to do so. On the contrary, they find that, wow, that's interesting. That means my students will better express their ideas. And so then they're investing time in them.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. We have a question from Natalia Nikolova. Thank you, Nayla, for this thorough presentation. You mentioned that you were inspired by the thought that history teaching resonates with the future. What is your opinion or thoughts on using multimedia like cartoons in history teaching? What are the innovative ways that we can think of to make history teaching more attractive to younger audiences? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think what happened during the pandemic surprised teachers. For long, the internet was available, and for long, technology was available. And we had cartoons, we had the videos, we had the games, and we had social media, but we rarely used them. We always came back to the classroom and, you know, came back to the textbook. And so what happened is that with the pandemic, teachers suddenly found that they are on the internet working from distance with their students, and they started looking and they saw that there is a lot that is available for us teachers, a lot really in terms of resources. So I would say and encourage every teacher to use any resource that he or she thinks is useful in her or his classroom, and then it's up to this teacher to decide if it works well or it can be used differently. This is what I say. There is no magic formula for this, but all resources are worthy of being considered for teaching. And students, our children, they are technologically savvy, I would say, and they work well with the screen, much better than us. So let's give them some of what suits them. Why not? Let's try it and let's share the experience. It's important for us also to provide some platforms for teachers to share experiences. And I think this webinar series is a beautiful series. And I would love to see more engagement eventually with future webinars of yours and other platforms too, because we learn a lot from each other.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Nayla. And I do hope that I managed to keep track of all the questions properly, despite me losing all of them by getting disconnected. But for the moment, I think we've raised all the questions. So if there are any more, please type them in. But I'm very glad that we were able to have a wonderful interaction with very, very reflective questions and a very enriching discussion. Thank you so much, Nayla, for joining us and working with us and continuing to work with us in matters that we find a great deal of synergy and resonance together. So thank you, and I hope you join us for our other webinars as well, because the next webinar is going to be from our colleague, Dr. Thamondaram Pillai Sanathanan from Jaffna University, talking about art as a methodology of teaching history. So exactly what we were talking about today and touching upon, and I think we will be able to elaborate and delve more into that topic as we tune in and talk to Sanathanan, who is both a teacher but also an artist and somebody who has actually lived through the conflict that Sri Lanka experienced in the north of the country in the last 30 years. So I think that it's going to be a very exciting presentation next time. So do join us. And thank you, Nayla. Thank you for really connecting all the dots of the topics that we've been trying to talk and really bringing us to discuss the brass tacks of teaching history as a teacher with the classroom, with young children. You know, it's very important that we go into the realities and understand the nuances of that. So thank you so much for joining. And the last few notifications from my side are about giving us feedback. So once you exit, you will receive an email shortly to give your feedback to the discussion. Please do leave some feedback with us so that we get food for thought for our next presentations. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to thank our supporters, Rosa Luxembourg Foundation, South Asia, the Alliance for Historical Dialogue and Accountability, who has been generously publicizing our event beyond that of Sri Lanka and getting us a global audience, because that is also a very important thing about these webinars. It can connect anyone from anywhere for more enriching discussions. And finally, the ICS team who is behind, Lihini, Vyanga, Nadine, Mario, all of you, thank you very much. And thank you, Association for Lebanese History in Lebanon and Nayla, for joining us this time. We hope to see you with next webinar on Wednesday, 9th December. Thank you and see you soon.
Thank you very much.